I'll never forget the sound of the champagne hitting my cheek, a sharp fizz, then the cold wetness trailing down my neck like a verdict. The chandelier scattered light into 100 tiny accusations. They laughed as if nothing had happened to the woman standing in the center of their world and yet outside it. Glass tinkled. A photographer shouted instructions I couldn't hear over the roar in my ears. Lucas, with his practiced look of disappointment, held up the papers and said, loud enough for every phone to catch, "Sign here, Magnolia." My hand trembled. The pen felt like a verdict only I could make real. They had chosen Christmas of all nights because spectacle is a language the powerful speak fluently. Snow clung to the hedges outside, glittering like applause. Inside, beneath a 20-foot tree, family and friends smiled the smiles of people who have never had to answer for what they break. Eleanor's laugh, thin, delighted, cut through everything. Vanessa filmed with a grin that was practiced cruelty. People pointed their phones the way hunters point rifles. I signed because hands shoved mine, because a man in a black pad said, "Make it quick," because there was no lawyer at my elbow, and because my husband had already narrated my life for an audience that would enjoy my collapse. I signed, and the signature looked like surrender. If you love comeback stories, hit like and subscribe. This one tops them all. After the lights, the cameras, the champagne, I remember the cold on my face as I was pushed into the snow. The snow smelled of exhaust, and something metallic, the taste of humiliation. They left me there, with the crunch of car tires disappearing and the glow of taillights pulling the warmth out of the world. I walked until my boots had a rhythm that matched the hollow in my chest, until a diner's neon sign blurred into something that promised coffee more than comfort. Years before that night, I had learned to make myself small. I was an orphan who learned the name of each penny before I learned how to say no. I learned to stitch seams so fine a tailor would envy them. I learned to accept invitations to pretend I belonged. Lucas noticed me after I stopped noticing myself. There's a certain hunger in a man who is good at imitating affection. He made me feel like an accidental stroke of luck. He married me because I fit into the tableau he wanted to present. Obedient, attractive, and quiet on matters of debt and embarrassment. 4 years. That's all it took for his patience to sour into entitlement. The mornings were the worst. The way he corrected my coffee, the way Ashley warmth would leak out of his voice when he spoke to his mother, the way he kept my last name like a pet leashed to his coat. When the Christmas party ended and I was left with a signature they could point to, I felt less like a person than a document. People kept saying, almost kindly, "It's better this way." They didn't mean it for me.
The diner booth was sticky with a history of other people's small tragedies. My coat still smelled of perfume and champagne. I sat alone, hands wrapped around a paper cup I had no appetite for, when my phone lit up with a number I didn't know. Patricia's voice was steady. She was the kind of woman who could make legalese sound human. Harold, who'd found me and waited until the paper thinness of my resolve allowed a conversation that felt like rescue, had been watching from the car. They told me something my bones refused to believe. My birth name was not an accident, and my blood had a different gravity than I had been taught to accept. "You're not who he thinks you are," Patricia said. "You're Magnolia Wellington." The name landed like a coin on a table. I thought at first it must be a trick, some late joke at the expense of someone too broken to fight back. Then came the documents, birth certificates, adoption papers sealed in an envelope with a hospital stamp, signatures validated. There was a photograph of a man with my eyes. He had my jawline, stubborn and private. He had a name I had heard in the papers all my life, Jonathan Wellington. He was, I was told, dying and had asked to see his child. There are moments when despair becomes a hinge. You can hang there, brittle, and let it rust, or you can open it and step through. When Patricia told me Jonathan's name, I felt the hinge give. It wasn't that suddenly everything would be easy. It was worse and better. There were people in that family who had cleaned their hands in the dark for a long time, men who would not let an inconvenient heir rise without trying to cut her down. There was Raymond Wellington, the uncle whose smile could never touch his eyes, who was in charge of arrangements and charities and the carefully curated distance that wealth breeds. Raymond, I would learn, owned the polite corridors and the private stairwells of power. He also owned the fear people felt when he cleared a room with a look. He was not only a powerful executive, he was, quietly and efficiently, the shadow behind certain debts and certain violences. In the language of investigations, he was the node everyone pointed to when naming the rumor that never made the news. That night, Patricia said, was arranged to humiliate you. It was designed to make you sign papers in public so you couldn't change your mind later. We have proof the documents were sent through his channels. Hearing that put a different weight on the signature I had made under glittering light. It was not merely Lucas's cowardice on display. It was part of a web that protected men like Raymond. If the people who had orchestrated my exposure had hoped humiliation would end me, they had calculated badly. The news of an inheritance depends on secrecy and timing. Raymond had an interest in keeping me small. Jonathan Wellington was a man who had built empires out of other people's silence.
He had never been showy. He preferred committees and foundations, names on bronze plaques rather than headlines. And yet he had a streak of stubborn fairness the family tried to laugh off as eccentricity. He had seen something in the papers Patricia and Harold brought him, a crooked ledger, a pattern of shell companies depositing money that ended up being spent on things that had nothing to do with legitimate business. He had reached for something like justice in his last days. If he had wanted to keep his family comfortable, he might have done nothing. He did the opposite. He opened the house and asked for the truth. Meeting him felt like meeting a stranger who knew me better than I knew myself. He had the same quiet force as the photographs suggested, and a tiredness that seemed to make him transparent. He spoke of responsibility in ways that made me want to be better than his expectations. "You don't owe me anything," he said, when I asked why he had sought me. "You owe the people who couldn't speak for themselves an answer." His hand was thin but strong when he touched my cheek. He was dying, and that knowledge made his insistence urgent and terrible. The danger was immediate. Raymond's influence was a lattice, a charity with an absentee board, a security company that answered to old loyalties, a PR firm that could bury headlines overnight. He had been siphoning attention and money into accounts with names that meant nothing until you followed the trail and found how many local shelters had never seen a single dollar. Worse, he had been using the Ashfords as willing, pliant conduits. Gregory had been careless in his greed. Eleanor took her cruelty personally. Lucas had been bought with promises, with social elevation and with the soft establishment of impunity. There were texts that suggested a coordination, emails that revealed meetings with men whose names were flags for committees you avoided if you wanted to sleep well. Patricia and Harold brought me files in a rented room above a bookstore. The fluorescent light made the papers look more honest. There were ledgers, invoices with ghost company names, travel receipts that didn't add up. There were photos of meetings in back rooms and the faint tremor of someone who'd lifted the curtain and felt acid on their hands. Nothing in those papers required me to pick up a weapon. They required patience and a plan. They required me to become something I wasn't yet, a threat in plain sight. I decided to stay hidden. If they had thought their humiliation would finish me, they hadn't accounted for the time I had to learn. That winter, I stopped being Magnolia Ross and began being Mellon Grant. The name felt like a garment I could wear until the seams were sewn properly. I enrolled in night classes, finance basics, corporate law primers, negotiation techniques, each small lecture a brick. In daylight, I learned how to carry myself. Notes on tone, on where to put hands during a conversation that might be recorded. In the evenings, Harold chased paper trails. Patricia threaded legal motion after motion into waiting positions. It was not glamorous. It was long and it was painstaking, and it smelled faintly of burned coffee and determination. I changed my clothes and my haircut and the way I answered questions. I lived in hotel rooms for months, reading balance sheets until numbers began to rearrange themselves into meaning. I practiced a laugh that was lighter, a face that suggested the sort of money that made people forget to ask where it came from. All of it was camouflage. My favorite part of the transformation was not the hair or the accent I forced for investor meetings. It was the way I learned to read a ledger like you read a face. A misposted debit is a confession if you know how to listen. Harold found friends who had been burned by the Ashfords and Raymond's network before. They gave us documents they had tucked away like ugly heirlooms. Patricia spent nights drafting subpoenas that would be useful months from now when patience met timing. We built a map of the corruption that didn't rely on gossip. We had receipts, wire transfers to shell companies that receded into other shell companies, invoices with no legitimate vendor names, dates that matched trips that went off the books. The more we found, the more I understood how power bought a kind of plausible denial. Men used procedures as a smokescreen and called it governance. There were moral decisions to make. I could have demanded immediate dramatic exposure. I could have walked in like a scorned ghost and shouted every crime into the world. But that would have been spectacle, and spectacle is what they used against me. Instead, I learned to be slow and cruel in the way a clock is cruel. I learned to file things with authorities who would not be moved by gossip. I met with an organized crime task force quietly, men and women who smelled of cigarettes and righteousness. They told me their role would require patient accumulation of evidence, that arrests would happen when the net was tight and unbreakable. Months passed like a different season. I sat at tables with men who had relevant degrees and women who had once been municipal clerks and now were key witnesses. I sat quietly and asked the right questions. I was careful to be in the right places: charity galas, investment receptions, a donor evening for a foundation that had suddenly become interesting after I gave $5 million as Malene Grant. I played the part of a European investor with taste and cash. Even that was a rehearsal of a different courage. Every laugh I faked, every knowing nod I practiced, was ammunition. The first time I walked back into the Ashford mansion after months away, it felt like a stage I had once tried to flee.
The entryway smelled the same, old cedar and the faint cologne that men like Gregory applied as if it were armor. Vanessa's smile was sharp enough to cut. She sized me up and looked away, already typing a caption. Eleanor's expression was a delighted puzzle. She liked to watch women come back smaller and tried to take credit for their deaths. They did not suspect that I was no longer theirs to shape. They thought they had tied me down with a signature. What they did not understand was how much harm a signature could reveal if someone read the ledger it belonged to. I planted myself at an investment dinner under my new name. I offered a plausible amount of money and a story of a small family office wanting to expand in their market. People liked predictability, and a number with a nice pedigree was predictable. I let Gregory show me his optimism. I let Eleanor preen. I let Lucas mistake my calm for weakness. Harold and Patricia fed me updates in short notes. Small admissions here, a slip of an email there. We collected phrases like trophies. Make it seem legitimate, one operative had written, not understanding that his own honesty would become an indictment. There was a night when I realized how many small selves I had shed to arrive at the person who could do the thing ahead of me. I stood in a powder room and looked at my reflection, a woman in a soft coat who had practiced this life into existence. My reflection was not cruel. It had patience in the mouth and a steady, dangerous certainty in the eyes. I thought of the diner, the way my hand shook as I signed a paper because I had been the kind of person who believed signatures could be the end. Now signatures were the beginning of a story that would write them as thieves. The shareholders' meeting was a trap dressed as corporate theater, a merger clause disclosed with fanfare and a promise of returns. It was, from Raymond's point of view, a chance to celebrate. For mine, it was a stage with the right press and the right witnesses. Patricia had scheduled a federal presence. Agents who had been waiting for a moment when a document publicly displayed could not be ignored. I had arranged for the projection of records. There is a small, barbaric delight in watching the expression of a room change when the air becomes full of evidence. I walked to the podium as Malene Grant, measured and polite. I spoke of investment philosophy, of fiduciary duty, of the responsibility of stewardship. They watched me with the casual contempt of people who have never been held accountable. Then I spoke the name that made the first ripple, Magnolia Grace Wellington. The room shifted. Cameras leaned forward like predators. I unbuttoned the armor I wore for business and revealed the person they had gossiped about while thinking she would never be an author of consequences. I did not scream. I laid out the ledger. I spoke about invoices. I showed wire transfers, photographs of meetings, text messages that placed Raymond at dinners where money changed hands in ways that could be traced through legitimate channels. I projected emails where Gregory had asked for approval of a donation without giving a vendor name. I read out a thread where an operative had written instructions to stage a public humiliation, confident it would terminate me as a legal actor. I read it calmly, and the calm was a different kind of violence. It forced them to hear themselves. They tried to scoff. Lucas looked like a man who had been handed a script and lost his place. Eleanor's laugh was brittle, shrinking as the cameras captured every bite of it. Raymond was immovable. He smiled, the way you smile when you are used to having your smile protect you. The room filled with people who had been paid to come, and people who had come to see a show. Some faces were embarrassed, others were furious. Then there were the doors opening, quiet at first, then with the authority that makes sound like thunder. Federal agents entered with a presence that did not need to shout. They carried subpoenas like promises. An organized crime task force moved in behind them with the kind of coordination that belongs in novels, but in truth belongs to long months of patient work. Arrests are not dramatic in themselves. The drama is in the moment ordinary furniture is replaced by booklets of dirt everyone had tried to keep under the rug.
Raymond's men were led away. Gregory and Eleanor were cuffed with expressions that had never imagined the handcuffs would feel real. Lucas found himself with a face in public that could not be refolded into the man he had pretended to be. We had not used violence. We had used documents, witness testimonies, and the moral force of exposure. It felt like a miracle, because people rarely see how ordinary bureaucracy can become the rod that levels power. The task force had enough to charge these men with fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Raymond's veneer of philanthropy cracked and revealed the ledger beneath. People asked later in interviews whether I had felt triumph. Triumph is a small word for what I felt. I felt vindication. Not that I enjoyed their fall, but that the system we had trusted to be impartial had been engaged and had acted. I felt closed loops of injustice unthreading. I felt the knowledge that people who had used holidays and public joy to perform cruelty would have to stand in daylight and answer for what they had done. I had no appetite for gloating. That is not who I became. I had an appetite for repair. The fallout was systemic. Courts moved slowly but decisively. Assets were frozen. Boards were reconstituted. The press, which had once delighted in my humiliation, found their headlines replaced by something they were less comfortable with: facts. Raymond did not possess the charisma the movies ascribe to villains. He had a peculiar administrative genius for obscurity, for layering false transactions until nothing made sense unless you knew where to look. We gave them where to look. The Organized Crime Task Force made arrests that were photographed and reported with a kind of impossible neatness. Gregory and Eleanor had to answer for embezzlement and complicity. Lucas's reputation unraveled into dust he could not sweep away. There was a private cost. My father, Jonathan, did not live long after the arrests. He had done what he wanted to do. He had called me, he had told me the truths I needed, and then he had given us his blessing to use whatever power his name carried to clean house. Sitting at his bedside is something I will carry the weight of forever. He took my hand with a certainty that made me small in a way that had nothing to do with humiliation. He said, "You do what's right, leave the rest." He died quietly, and in that quiet there was an immense sorrow and also a deep sense of completion. Taking stewardship of the company was not the revenge the tabloids tried to paint. It was a responsibility. I could have sold everything, walked away with a different kind of safety, and perhaps I would have been kinder to myself. Instead, I remembered what Jonathan had asked: answer for the people. I kept the company alive and reoriented it. We set up funds for the people Raymond had drained, shelters that did not exist before but had served as talking points on glossy brochures. We created scholarships for children from the neighborhoods his fraud had hollowed out. We invested in affordable housing in projects that had been promised and delayed. I implemented oversight because I had seen how the absence of oversight becomes the blueprint for theft. There were smaller comforts that mattered. Harold, who had become a friend in the way that work breeds solidarity, moved south with his wife. Patricia pressed on in courtrooms and later took a position in oversight. Vanessa deleted old videos and, to her credit, wrote an op-ed about the cruelty of online mobs. Whether she meant it or not, people forgave and forgot in ways that made me uneasy. Some of the Ashfords paid fines and did time. Some rebuilt in smaller, quieter ways. The law did its thing, imperfect but real. Walking to my father's grave that first winter after the verdicts, snow laid itself on the world like apologies. I stood with my hands in my pockets and remembered the woman who had signed in front of a tree and a million lights, the woman who had once believed a signature could end her story. I pressed my palm to the polished stone and whispered things men and women whisper at graves, gratitude and regret at the same instant. Jonathan had left me not only an estate, but also a mandate. Use what power you have with humility. I have tried to honor that mandate. There are people who ask whether what I did was too cold. I answer, justice is not warmth. Justice is the work of making balance where convenience created inequality. I never wished anyone harm for the sheer pleasure of it. When I look back now, the hardest thing is not the memory of champagne on my cheek, but the knowledge of how many people allowed it to happen because spectacle made them feel safe. The real change, the one I wanted to see, was in the community. The shelters that finally had money, the scholarships to a college that had recruited but never paid for children who deserved a shot. The integrity program we funded to teach how to spot corruption in its earliest disguises. I married again, though not in the way I had once thought marriage would come to me. I married work that kept its promises rather than lovers. I found companionship in people who were patient and unafraid of the truth. I learned to love a different kind of silence, the silence of a board meeting where everyone is honest, and the silence of a winter morning when the world is unadorned and steady. Once, when a journalist asked me how it felt to see Raymond taken away, I said that I had felt sorrow, because men like him are often symptoms of systems rather than monsters. That answer irked some people who wanted the catharsis of a villain's fall. I would not deny them catharsis, but my work is not about theater. It is about rebuilding things that are useful, homes that shelter, funds that feed, schools that teach. I have learned that the best kind of victory is one that looks inward and says, now, what do we repair? People still send messages. Some are forgiving, some are raw. A woman wrote to me once and said, "You made me feel like I could stand up." Another accused me of orchestrating a show. Both messages are true in small ways. I stand up every morning because no one else can stand for me. I also stand because I learned that strategy, patience, and law are tools for those who will use them for good. On quiet nights, I still hear the pop of a champagne cork in my memory. It's a sound that now reminds me of thresholds, the moment I left shame on a curb, and the moment I walked into rooms I had once been excluded from. The signature I made in public no longer feels like a chain, but like a historical footnote. The real signature that matters is the one I put on documents that fund shelters and scholarships and open doors. When I think about Lucas, I feel a kind of uncomplicated sorrow. He was never my main antagonist in the way Raymond was. Lucas was a man who used others because he had been taught that love is a reward tied to performance. He lost a name and a life that had been fashioned for his convenience. When I think of Eleanor and Gregory, I think the same way. They are people who chose cruelty because it kept their houses tidy. The law caught up with them, and that is a mercy I do not begrudge. Mercy and accountability are not mutually exclusive. They exist on the same axis for those willing to accept both.
Years later, I return to the grave sometimes with a thermos and sit for a while in the quiet. Snow will fall in the same bright, accusatory way, and I will let it land until my scarf is flecked white. I whisper things that are almost prayers. Thank you, forgive me, teach me to do better. Then I go back to work. People like tidy endings. I won't give them a vengeance fantasy or a simple closure. Life is messy. Institutions are messier. What I did could never promise perfection. Instead, it promised something more durable, acknowledgement, restitution where possible, and the slow, grinding work of making sure the same note of corruption could not quietly hide under the dignity of a name again. If you ask whether I regret the nights of study, the lies I told to create an opening, the person I had to become to stand in the places they had reserved for men, I would say no. I would say I regret the thing that made me necessary, systems that allow secrecy. I would say I found my power not by breaking people, but by compelling institutions to do their work. At the site where all that had happened years ago, the mansion stands quieter now. The tree still casts its long shadow every December, but it no longer hides the ledger stains. Children play on sidewalks where once cars pulled in and out like predators. There is a small plaque on a building we refurbished that reads simply, "For those who were told their names didn't matter." I visit it sometimes, not to celebrate myself, but to remember that humiliation is a wound that collective work can heal. Was this perfect justice or too far? Comment below. I read every comment.